Thank you for joining us on another edition of Against the Current, coming to you from the Skyline Club atop the Old Republic Building in downtown Chicago. My guest on this edition is one of the most dangerous men in Illinois. He is Mark Glennon, the founder of WirePoints, wirepoints.com. Mark, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You know why I say you're one of the most dangerous men in Illinois, don't you? Because you're a lawyer by training, corporate lawyer, then you were a venture capitalist, and now you're an opinion writer. But here's the thing, you are able to understand budgets and simple math, and you're able to write cogently and explaining to people what the real deal is behind all of the financial chicanery at the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois level. So some of the pieces that you have written about property taxes and pensions and just kind of budget malaise more generally makes you someone who is not particularly well liked in establishment circles in this state.
I don't really care that much, but thank you very much. That's a very good description. I'm flattered.
Well, why don't we start with wirepoints.com, this outlet that you created about 3.5 years ago. Successful career, as I said, as a corporate attorney, a venture capitalist. Why not just leave like the rest of the state who can leave is leaving? Why found this outlet and try and explain to people what exactly is happening and what the results of what's happening are ultimately going to be?
I was born in frustration, really. I started following these things pretty closely back 15 years ago. In fact, I first wrote that Illinois was broke, I think, in 2002. I thought the media was missing the story and the public was uninformed. So I just gradually got involved in it, looking at it more and more closely, and it really became an obsession. So I started WirePoints initially as a hobby, doing it while I was doing my other work, and am now transitioning into making it a full-time career.
So thinking about that, thinking about then 14 going on 15 years of following this stuff increasingly closely,
Right.
What is the thing that has most surprised you over that period of time in terms of the trajectory of Illinois and the way that our problems have been dealt with?
Disregard for the seriousness of the problem. I think that there are very few people in the legislature that understand how bad it is. Certainly even fewer with the courage to stand up and talk about it. And the public remains out to lunch, largely because I think the media coverage has been inadequate.
So do we have, I was talking to a guy, Chuck Marone, who's a civil engineer by training, kind of the same story as you. He started as a civil engineer, and based on his work with municipal governments, he started to be alarmed at what municipalities, local units of government are doing across the nation in terms of being incentivized to invest in infrastructure they couldn't finance, they couldn't maintain, that is bankrupting these local units of government. Illinois is a special kind of crazy, as he described it, but it's really something that's systemic across the nation. So he kind of comes from the same place, going from one profession, seeing what's happening, and then transitioning into another one. And one of the things he said that I like, he said, it's not that states like Illinois and local units of government in Illinois have problems, because problems implies that there are solutions. What is really the case is there are predicaments that have outcomes. Is Illinois in a situation with, let's say, pensions, where we have a problem that has a solution, or are we in a predicament that has an inexorable outcome?
Yeah, he put it a very good way. I've been kind of saying the same thing, that this is an exercise at this point in disaster mitigation. There's no easy solution to this. It's going to get bad. It's going to get worse, rather. It's going to take a long time to fix. And I think we have to have the honesty to start talking about how bad it is and how long it's going to take. The first step towards coming up with an appropriate remedy is measuring the malady appropriately, and we still haven't done that yet.
Now, you've called for a code or a provision in the federal bankruptcy code that would allow states to go bankrupt. You have suggested that with respect to our unfunded pension obligations in this state, which are the largest in the nation, that there really is no way out to kind of reset the table and prevent Illinois from becoming a failed state, short of bankruptcy reorganization, let's say the way that Detroit recently did.
There are only two options to cut the pensions because of the Supreme Court rulings. You can amend the state constitution to get rid of the state pension protection clause. That's a long process, and it may not work in the long run anyway, because there are still federal constitutional issues to deal with.
Or may not work in time.
May not work in time. And the only other option then is bankruptcy. And we know from the Detroit case and other court rulings that almost certainly will work to cut pensions. It's in place now. Chapter 9 of the Federal Bankruptcy Code is there for municipalities and cities and towns. It has to be authorized by the state. We don't have that authorization from the state yet. And you could amend the bankruptcy code at the federal level to allow states to file as well. And no one, again, in the local press has been talking about that, but certainly people are thinking about it. William Isaac is the former head of the FDIC. He said we should have done this long ago, that Illinois and Chicago should be in bankruptcy right now, and he's one of the foremost experts on insolvency in the country.
So make the case for bankruptcy as opposed to trying to amend the Constitution or trying to come up with something that passes constitutional muster, as the Illinois Supreme Court defines that provision in the Constitution you referenced. Give us the kind of the two scenarios. One is these pension funds, like for example, in the city of Chicago, where you have police and pension funds that are less than 30% funded, that are death spiraling, go upside down and they're no longer able to pay current beneficiaries, and what the implications of that would be versus the implications for pensioners of reorganizing under some kind of bankruptcy protection. Because one of the things that I always argue is my position in support of structural pension reform, I'm actually on the side of the public sector pensioners, and their union leadership is not.
That's right.
And so, I mean, make the case that the bankruptcy path would really be in the benefit, to the benefit of these pensioners, at least as compared to these pension funds becoming insolvent.
Yeah. First of all, let me be clear that for any particular city or town or for the state, whether bankruptcy is really going to help very much and whether it would be a good idea is very specific for those. You have to look really closely at the facts and what their debts are. And it's not to say that it's a good option. The point is that it's inevitable. It's the only option. So you really have to look at it from that perspective. If the circumstances are right and you do a bankruptcy, you really do get a clean, fresh start. It's a broad power to get rid of everything bad that you don't like. Union contracts potentially, which is why the unions don't like it. The unfunded portion of pension debt is treated just like any other unsecured debt in bankruptcy, where it gets cut pro rata with all the other creditors. Now, in practice, that hasn't turned out that way. Actually, pensioners have gotten a lot better deal than bondholders.
And that's what happened in Detroit.
That's what happened in Detroit, that's right. And there's a kind of a long list of other circumstances. To the extent we have much Chapter 9 history, we really don't. But that has been the general rule.
So I'm a state of Illinois worker, or I'm a retired teacher. My pension fund is trending towards insolvency, or there's this bankruptcy option, or there's, graduating the state income tax and a LaSalle Street financial transaction tax and a city income tax and property tax increases and sugary drink taxes, basically burning everything down to pay my pension. Give me the scenario for the state worker, the retired teacher. How does one favor me that be the least negatively impactful on me versus the others?
It may depend on the individual pensioner. I think a current retiree with a big fat pension probably is going to end up getting cut more. I think at the end of the day, we'll probably have some mechanism in place that allows for progressivity in how this is done. And some courts have kind of allowed some leeway in that, special protection for the really small pensioners that really need their pension. And there are those out there.
Sure. The guy,
absolutely.
The individual has a pension that's similar to Social Security, $35,000.
Exactly.
Versus the school superintendent that has a present value pension of $10 million.
Right. In fact, I would love to see that allowance written specifically into the Federal Bankruptcy Code. It's not there now, so you have to kind of work it out on a one-off basis. But clearly that's something should be happening in Congress right now. They should allow for that, for unequal treatment of pensioners depending on what their circumstances are, really. So basically it's pretty simple. All unsecured debts get thrown into one pot in theory, and they're cut pro rata depending on how much you need to cut them to give the city a fresh start. Well, absent a fresh start, you're looking at getting zero. You're looking at going into a death spiral. We're already in one. Let's face it.
And saying when this pension fund can no longer pay out its beneficiaries, you have this guarantee, but we don't have the funds. So you want to litigate this? We'll go litigate this. But in the meantime, you're going to be receiving IOUs, not your pension checks on a monthly basis. So what kind of position does that put you in?
Yeah, let's get real specific. And pensioners take a lot of solace in what the Supreme Court has said, that you now have direct recourse against the city of Chicago, for example, when the pensions runs dry. You can sue the city directly for, well, what good is that really going to do you? So you're going to go to court to sue the city to collect a judgment. They're going to discover that all the city's assets are already liened up. They've got security interests, mortgages that have secured the bondholders. And with every day that passes, all these new bond issues you see with all these very aggressive, novel, flaky ideas to lien up all the assets that are out there, there's going to be less and less for those pensioners to get.
So the city and the state are effectively judgment proof.
If they're not now, they will be. And yeah.
And then so now the other side of this, because you mentioned the borrowing, and the city of Chicago continues to borrow, sell bonds. The state of Illinois continues to borrow at 12% per annum. It's basically paying kind of loan shark rates to keep the lights on. What kind of responsibility do the rating agencies and the bond issuers on Wall Street have for the predicament that Illinois and Chicago are in?
I think they're going to find out in court the hard way at the end of the day. There's going to be a lot of litigation over this. The rating agencies are prostitutes. They are forced prostitutes. I have some sympathy for them. They're caught in the middle of two things. They're hired and paid by the issuer, by the city. So, I hope everybody that's listening has some common sense about what that means. On the other hand, if they're too rosy in what they give to the people that hire them, they'll get sued at the end of the day. So Moody's, for example, that has been relatively aggressive in criticizing the city.
And in downgrading the city's debt.
Downgrading the city's debt, that's right. They just had a huge settlement, multi-$100 million settlement going back to the subprime crisis. So they're getting badmouthed and slammed by Rahm to go easy on them at the same time that they're looking at that history. So I do have sympathy for them in some respect. But there's no direct sort of immediate responsibility that they have on this, no way to discipline them as to how do they sort that out right now. But like I say, I think at the end of the day, you're going to see a lot of rating agencies, bond houses, lawyers that have given opinions, everybody else in litigation.
One of the things that has happened is you have people that have said for a long time that, well, at some point the bond markets are going to seize up and Chicago, state of Illinois are no longer going to be able to borrow. We've been saying that for a long time and it hasn't happened. So to some extent for the public, oh, these guys are just the people who cried wolf. They're just using this as a predicate to try and squeeze us to the benefit of their Wall Street friends. Why is it that Wall Street continues to allow Chicago and Illinois to borrow despite rating the credit of both entities as junk, effectively?
Because there's a huge appetite in the private sector everywhere in the world, really, for high-yield junk debt. So it doesn't end in a cataclysmic event where suddenly you can't sell any bonds, although that could happen at some point. Instead, you gradually pay more and more for those bonds. And there's a big appetite for that. So, investors that are looking, if you go to the private markets right now and buy junk bonds, you can easily do that through an ETF, 6% or something like that. Well, a Chicago bond might look relatively attractive compared to that, especially if you think about the mortgage that's behind it. The entire game with these most recent bond ratings has been what assets are pledged behind it. Nobody cares as much anymore about the general credit behind this, the city or any towns or the state. They're looking at what they get to back it up. And that does hold up in bankruptcy. That's strong. So
does it turn out that the bond issuers are basically playing the same game as the public sector unions, saying, wait a second, the city, the state, they have the power to tax. They have the power to cut spending over here to pay for our pensions to the extent they need to. So they're both playing the same game. The city can do more in terms of taxation. The state can do more in taxation. That's what the public sector unions are effectively saying. That's what the bond houses are saying.
That's right. And one of the primary assets that gets mortgaged up are the flows of money that come from Springfield to the city. Those are all pledged behind these bonds. And I think the bondholders are saying, well, the state's never going to cut that off. There's always going to be something coming in there. They call that appropriation risk. They've started talking about that recently. But it would require some coordination. If you really wanted to stick it to the bondholders and the state and the city ever cooperated, as they should be doing, then there'd be a problem for
Well,
those bonds.
well, and there have been a lot of proposals promoted, not just by kind of conservative free market think tanks, but to say that one of the ways the state writes its financial ship is to eliminate the LGDF, the local government distribution fund,
Right.
the distribution of income taxes, the 10% that local units of government get back from the state for their respective share of income taxes that are produced within their corporate boundaries. So that's like a real possibility that the state could say, yeah, that's a pot of money that we could cut off to local units of government to try and salvage ourselves.
That's right. I think a lot of these things will ultimately be litigated as to whether those things hold up too. And there are other protections for bondholders, a lot of which taxpayers don't know are in there. For example, CPS. I mean, how many people know this? CPS bonds are protected by an automatic property tax increase if the bonds ever go into default. This has gotten very little attention, but that would come as a shock to most homeowners. And we're now looking at a very real possibility that's going to happen at some point.
So that's essentially another instance where your home in Illinois, in Chicago, not really your home, it's collateral for local units of government, for state government, whether it's to pay bondholders or to ultimately finance public sector pensions.
Particularly in the suburbs where we have many just silly rates, 4 or 5% on property taxes. You really don't own your home. You've got a junior interest behind not only the lender that has your first mortgage, but behind a perpetuity owed to the government, secured by a first lien on your house that's senior to your interest and the lender, the mortgage lender. So what do you really have? You got the option value sort of that maybe your house is going to appreciate in the future. And of course, the direction has been going in the opposite direction. I mean, as we've talked about before, there are 500,000 houses in Illinois that are deeply underwater on their board, more than 25% below the value of the mortgage. That is, the value of the house is more than 25% below the amount of the mortgage. That's a tragedy.
500,000 homes, that's 1/5 of all homes in Illinois that are significantly underwater.
I'm not sure if it's 1/5. I think that might be right. But and this is a Realty Track study. These aren't my numbers, by the way. It's a reputable shop that has come up with those numbers. That's right.
And so you wrote a piece recently where you invoked the line from The Big Short, Steve Carell's line, "It's happening."
It's happening. That's right.
And so, and when he meant it's happening, that the real estate bubble was bursting. What did you mean when you kind of expropriated his line to apply it to Illinois, that it's happening?
Well, with the subprime crisis, as you remember, you turn on your TV and, oh my God, the screens were bleeding red. The Dow was off 500-600 points. Everybody knew what happened. It happened quite quickly. Here it's a slow burn. We're just gradually bleeding out. It is happening. We've got, think of the combination of circumstances. We've got people leaving the state, employers leaving the state, the tax base is shrinking, and government revenue is shrinking. And we still have all these debts and problems. We're not able to pay what we got. So if that's not a death spiral that's going to get worse, I don't know what is. We're going to have to do something drastic to break the psychology of that death spiral.
So one of the observations you made in the same piece I'm referencing is that Illinois has, in terms of your property taxes as a percent of your home value, it's almost 80% higher than the national average. That's the Realty Track study.
Yeah.
And so how did we get here? Because if you hear the political class talk for the last 20 years that I've been in Illinois politics, we've had property tax freezes. We have property tax caps, I should say. We have tax caps to prevent spiraling, skyrocketing property tax increases. So how is it that we find ourselves so far above the national average in terms of property taxes as a percentage of home value? How is it we find ourselves paying the highest property taxes in the nation with these so-called property tax caps?
Yeah, those caps have not been effective, obviously. And I haven't been able to catalog all the holes in them. But for one thing, if I understand it correctly, the caps only apply to spending for operating expenses and not for capital expenditures. So that's one way they've gotten around them. There are other statutory exceptions that have been in those. But most importantly, just with the other problems that the state has had, people leaving, loss of manufacturing jobs and the rest, the value there's other forces pushing down the value of the house. So the value of the house goes down, and that means the percentage of property taxes that you have to pay goes up. And suddenly in Park Forest, for example, where I grew up, you're looking at a 5 or 6% property tax on homes, which is the average down there.
So again, thinking about you starting to look at this in 2002 as a professional, both in corporate law and the financial world, venture capital, what are the lessons to be had looking back 15 years, both on the property tax front, on the unfunded pension liability front? What are the lessons to be learned of how we went from where we were, say, in the mid-90s to where we are 20 years later?
Well, the clear lesson doesn't come from that experience. It comes from previously practicing law, doing bankruptcy, and in venture capital. I was a corporate lawyer doing transaction work. We all got dragged into doing bankruptcy work. This was in Texas in the 80s when everything crashed. The first thing they tell you is, if you do it big, do it fast, and do it decisively. An insolvency proceeding, a reorganization or bankruptcy. You got to knock it out fast. Same thing in venture capital. Most of what we invest in are dogs. Once you see that it's not working, the business model is broken, you cut it off or change your business model. Well, all the forces in politics are aligned to do the opposite. You downplay the problem, you string it out, you denial, delay. And so, we violated the fundamental rules that any insolvency practitioner knows.
Well, and that's because, of course, no politician wants to be the one on whose watch their unit of government went bankrupt. And nobody wants to be Gray Davis, right? And be the boogeyman, be the bête noire for everything that's wrong, because it all came crashing down, even though it may have built up over a number of years. It all came crashing down under you. So it's, let me survive until the next term or until the next guy gets in. And it seems to me this is what you see happening all over the place, including with our schools. CPS, Governor Rauner, has suggested that bankruptcy may be a good thing for the Chicago public school systems. And of course, he has been roundly criticized by the mayor and by CPS officials as, uncaring about students and K through 12 education in Chicago and the like.
Yeah, I mean, Moody's was pretty frank a couple of weeks ago. They came out with a piece and it talked about the death spiral. Finally, a rating agency started putting it in pretty much those terms. But in the case of CPS, they said expressly one option maybe should be you stop contributing to the pensions. That's harsh, but that would shock the system. Suddenly I think the pensioners would then realize that they better do something and agree to real structural reform that's going to be fair across the board, progressive, everything else. But until you get that kind of shock, they don't seem to be interested in doing anything.
You mentioned people leaving. United Van Line study for 2016 just came out. It finds Illinois for the 5th year of the last 8 in the bottom 5, meaning most outmigration. We're basically tied for first in outmigration with New Jersey. 63% of the moving trucks are moving out, and only 37% of the moving trucks are coming into Illinois. And there's a great disparity in terms of household income of who's moving out and who's moving in. It's about $20,000 difference between those people leaving Illinois and those people coming into Illinois, which is the largest gap in the nation as well. So what does that mean? That the tax base continues to dwindle? People that are upwardly mobile, that are on a career track where they're making good salaries, they're leaving. People that are making less money are coming in. What do those trend lines tell us?
Well, that's right. And it's important to emphasize there's a lot of lag in that data. The information that you talked about with high-income taxpayers leaving and the loss of the tax base mostly comes from federal data, and they've been delaying the release of that. I think the last figures we have are from 2014.
Right.
There's a lot of suspicion, by the way, that the federal government has deliberately withheld releasing that data because they don't want to make it
perish the thought.
Obvious that blue states are bleeding like crazy, which they are. Maybe we'll start getting better data on that faster. And also in terms of loss of people, it takes a long time to decide you're going to leave. Right. You got to get another job. Your spouse has to get another job, sell your house, and you can't leave if your house is underwater. And there are, we've all heard many stories of people like that. But, you got this shocking poll number that's been out there for a couple of years that with half of Illinoisans saying they want to leave. Well, that's just devastating. But it's going to take a while for that to materialize. And, you hear progressives say, well, we had a temporary income tax and there wasn't a, big departure during that period, and they only started departing after the Oh, come on, it takes a long time. There's a long time on this thing. It's called the Laffer curve in economics, where, you go past the top of the curve, and where every further tax increase actually results in lower revenue. And in fact, on my site, I've got some stories from quite a few downstate communities raise their sales tax rate, but they're getting less sales tax revenue now. Well, that's exactly what's happening. And so that's the issue.
You come screaming down that curve like a roller coaster.
Right. So then you got a real problem.
And you've written about this, a kind of microcosm of the larger problem is South Suburban Cook County. And give us, try and make some of these things tangible for people, which is always the struggle, because you're talking about financial data and financial markets, and it's kind of a lot of abstractions. But some of the research that you've done with respect to South Suburban Cook County really brings what we're talking about home in a material way.
It is, and the worry, of course, is that that's going to spread, and that's really an indicator of what's to come for other communities. In the 4 townships directly south of the suburbs, the average tax rate, as simply a simple percentage of your property value, is over 5%. That's 3 times the national average, which I think is 1.25 or something, and literally tens of thousands of those homes are underwater. We sold, when my dad passed away 5 years ago, we sold his house to an African American woman, single mother. She's now underwater.
This is in Park Forest?
In Park Forest, yeah. And those are, there's just in Park Forest, there are tens of thousands of cookie cutter homes. So everybody's in the same situation there. And it's a personal tragedy what happened to her.
And so, another one just in Flossmoor, just to make this real also for people that are successful. Craig Duchossois' home. We've talked about this, but we talked about this on my show. But Craig Duchossois, who's a billionaire family, the Duchossois own Arlington, Churchill Downs, and been Thrall Car, very successful family. So Craig Duchossois sold his mansion in Flossmoor a little more than a decade ago for $900,000. It's like 6,000 square foot, a pool house.
Yep.
Right? This is a massive spread that if it was on the North Shore would be $5, $7, $10 million.
That's right.
He sold it for $900,000. A radiologist bought it. That radiologist paid $250,000 in property taxes over over the ensuing decade that he owned it, and he sold it for $415,000.
Yeah.
This is like the Romney home in Detroit before Detroit went bankrupt formally, where it went from over the course of a decade, it went from $800,000 to $600,000 to zero. It was raised.
Yeah. I know that house, and if you grew up around the area, most everybody knows the house because it's kind of a barometer.
Stands out.
Yeah, stands out. On top of a hill, beautiful home. And, Duchossois can survive that, but a lot of people, you lose $500,000 in your home's equity, and you got, that's a big hit.
While you paid $250,000 in property taxes over a decade.
Right.
That is a hammering. And so it seems to me, help me explain. You're in the suburbs. You're in North Suburban Cook County, but these suburban families, sophisticated professionals in suburban Cook and the collar counties, they don't seem to appreciate what's happening. Where, as you were talking about earlier, K through 12 spending goes up by 30% over a decade. Your home value goes down by 30% over that same decade as you're continuing to pay higher and higher property taxes, mostly to fund your local schools. And the response from the electorate seems to be, I want more of that.
I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, Dan, because I'm trying my writing to reach reasonable progressives to try to get into their mindset. And I can't say I've done a very good job of it. It's still somewhat of a mystery to me. One line you hear constantly is, it can't be this bad. And there's all this money out there. I'm sure you've heard that line too. There's all this money out there. Somehow, it's a matter of taxing them or making taxes more progressive or something like that. Well, there is a lot of money out there, but it's not easy to tax, and it's very migratory. Money leaves, money walks if you try to get it at a state level, and they just don't appreciate what's happening.
So, and the property tax issue, with, we talked about what needs to be done with respect to public sector pensions and this, kind of unfathomable 130 billion dollar unfunded liability. I mean, it almost doesn't matter. I know Truth in Accounting puts our total debt at the state level at about $250 million, and our total asset valuation about 30 billion. So, I mean, 8 to 1. That's, I think, the definition of bankruptcy, effectively. But so we talked about the reorganization that needs to happen to make sure public sector pensioners receive at least some approximation of what they were guaranteed and what they worked for. They held up their end, and I don't blame them for saying I deserve what I was promised because I held up my end. What about for the homeowner, the property owner in this state, and what to be done about property taxes that destroy the largest investment most people are going to make in their lifetimes?
Sure, they've been singled out to bear this burden more heavily, and of course, for average wage earners, that's probably, it might be their only place of savings. It's certainly their primary place where they've put their wealth, and it's gone.
And so in your estimation, I mean, what's your proposed solution to deal with these spiraling property tax increases to try and help people protect the equity they build up in their homes, to help people get out from underneath them if they're tracking to pay for their home another half-time or full-time in addition to the 30-year fixed mortgage just in property taxes?
Well, certainly one thing that should be done right now, I think, is a real property tax freeze across the state, because I am really concerned that the psychology of this is going to break fast, that everybody's going to realize that we're in a death spiral. And once that becomes the common opinion, then you'll have a buyer strike, essentially, and the problem will compound, obviously. You got to do something to break that psychology. And if you give them a permanent, real property tax freeze, you'd at least be telling them that it's not going to get any worse than it is now.
A permanent, real property tax freeze means the property tax bill they're paying in 2017, that's the property tax bill. That's the actual dollar amount you're going to pay at some point indeterminate, or maybe in perpetuity,
right?
Until at least we get back to kind of the national average in terms of property taxes versus home value.
That's the best immediate thing I think we could do to head off this break in psychology that I'm fear is coming.
Well, and so I mean, when you have 37,000 people to 100,000 people net leave on an annual basis, I think Illinois Policy Institute has one person's left Illinois every 5 minutes for the last 15 years, and took in aggregate some 25 to 30 billion dollars in effectively gross domestic product for the state of Illinois with them. I mean, it's an unbelievable amount in terms of the shrinking tax base that you referenced. So what does that look like? Do we just continue on this 30, 50, 70, 100,000 people continue to leave year after year until some point? Or is there, like, as you say, a breaking point where you have like a wildcat run on the state of Illinois? Everybody takes whatever they've got that isn't nailed down, sell for pennies on the dollar to get out, and they get out before it gets worse. I mean, you give me the Cormac McCarthy dystopian endgame for what's going to happen to Illinois if we don't do something serious and structural.
Yeah, that was the point of that It's Happening article that I wrote. I don't see one single moment blowing up like that. I think it'll continue to just gradually worsen, unless we adopt a whole range of radical things that have to be changed. But it'll just continue to get worse and worse, and it'll be a gradual process. And you and I will talk about this, 2 years from now, and it'll be much, much worse. And
except we may be talking about it in Charleston, South Carolina, and not here, like so many people. So there has been a radical proposal of sorts, radical compromise that has been advanced in the General Assembly. As we sit here today, we don't know where it's going to go, but this is a grand bargain. And anytime that phrase is used, you should be afraid, very afraid. Between Republicans and Democrats in the Senate at the leadership level, nothing's been voted upon, but it essentially re-increases the state income tax to maybe 5%, take it back from 3.75 where it's at now to 5%, increase the corporate tax, maybe a tax on sugary drinks, maybe not. These are the component parts on the revenue side. And in exchange for that, you get prospective term limits for legislative leaders and some kind of window dressing, workers' comp reform, and the ability of school districts to contract out for certain services to try and lower the cost of operation for school districts. Christine Radogno, the Senate Republican leader, John Cullerton, the Senate President, have negotiated the broad outlines of this deal. What's your assessment of that sort of grand bargain at this juncture as a way to try and deal at least with some of the unpaid bills and pressing problems in the short term prior to perhaps structural reforms in the medium term?
Yeah, it's not grand and it's not a bargain.
It's like the Holy Roman Empire. You're a Voltaire. It's neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. Got it. Okay. All right. Why?
And you are deep in yeah, I think they and other proponents are driven by the political pressure to do something.
Yes.
And you got to look like you're doing. They'll go back to their concern. I tried my best, and you could debate the merits of this all you want. We could have a long discussion about that. But does anybody really doubt that at the end of the day, this would be the reaction that the average Illinoisan has? They'll see their taxes go up, not their property taxes, but their other taxes go up dramatically. They will see none of these other reforms. Now, there will be benefits that come out of it. More money will flow to social service agencies. I'm all for that. That's great. They're not going to see that, though. And it's not going to solve the problem. It's not going to pay off the $11 billion total bills that we have. It's not going to reinstate the budget that was initially going to all those social service agencies. But from the individual person's perspective, they'll see a tax increase and no benefits. Now,
So this is buying some space. This is kind of the old problem of concentrated benefits and diffuse costs. So this buys some space for the concentrated benefits, those that are owed money by the state, vendors, social service providers, gives them some percentage of what they're owed. So it kind of creates some space and some, okay, it's, we're going to make good on what we owe you. While at the same time, what does a massive tax increase do? It shrinks the tax base even further. It erodes the financial wherewithal of the state because more and more of its productive people are going to be more and more inclined to head for the borders.
Yeah, and there's a corporate tax increase in there too. So, they too will be still less enthralled about Illinois than they are now.
And it seems to me, with respect to Radogno, this seems to me, my own opinion on this is another negotiating the terms of surrender deal. This is what Republicans did with Medicaid expansion, Obamacare Medicaid expansion, when Governor Quinn was the governor, and he was one of the first governors to adopt Obamacare in toto, including the unfundable Medicaid expansion. And Medicaid was a budget buster prior to the expansion under Obamacare, much less what we're projected to be when the federal government stops paying 90% of the freight. So the Republican position on this, that we have to do something to buy ourselves some space to do the good thing, the big thing. You're not buying that because why?
Because it's not dramatic enough, and the taxpayers will respond as I indicated. I think it'll just increase flight from the state, and the death spiral will continue.
Christine Radogno has said that this would be, at least part of this, as she said previously, real pension reform. To get on us a path to...
Now, I'm going to stop you right there, because we got to put this... That consideration argument is the silliest gimmick. We got to kill this thing and put it to bed. Cullerton has been pushing. It's a Cullerton gimmick. The idea is that, the Supreme Court said you can't cut benefits, but you can make an equal trade. Well, of course you can make an equal trade. You're going to trade off one benefit, and it's got to be equal. Well, somehow he thinks that people are going to engage in a trade that's going to reduce the cost to the state. Well, no, they're not measuring the other side of it. The city of Chicago put this in their sworn pleadings in some of the litigation that went up to the Supreme Court. They said, by definition, this can't work. It seems pretty obvious to me logically. And what's the backup? They claim maybe up to $1 billion would be. Let's see the report on that. Let's see the actuarial report. I've asked for it. They won't produce it. There's nothing. I guarantee you that if they ever produce a report, it doesn't have the cost side on it. It'll measure what they're trading away in benefits, but the state has to give something back in return, and that's not being counted in there.
Even if you accepted their numbers at face value, talk about $1 billion
$1 billion
in
is
savings.
not, that'll put us back to where we were, probably 8 months ago on the pension debt. It's not, it doesn't make any
I mean, that's how essentially bottomless it is.
That's right. That's right.
So it just goes back to the opening discussion, which is we have a predicament with outcomes, not a problem that's solvable, sans constitutional change or something that is structural with any of these things. But there are things that are not, that there are not constitutional hurdles to clear. Obamacare expansion of Medicaid, there's no state constitutional provision for that. That could be rolled back. But we have the governor saying, hey, Congress, don't make hasty changes to Obamacare. It seems to me one of the problems we've always had in this state, as you have politicians trying to kind of just create a little more space to get us through one more cycle, is a complete lack of urgency with respect to how dire these predicaments are that we're facing.
Yeah, and Medicaid, of course, is another scary one, and this is one that I don't claim to have any expertise in. It's going to be driven by whatever happens with Obamacare, and we saw just today, apparently, the Rauner administration sent a letter to our congressional delegation saying, hey, be careful here because you could really spike our Medicaid bill on this if you do this wrong. I don't know whether that's true. I don't know how this is going to play out, but that's a big item in our budget.
What about K through 12 education? Even the governor is proposing continuing to spend more money on K through 12 education. It is interesting. This against the backdrop of a piece in the Washington Post by their writer Emma Brown, who writes on on K through 12 and higher ed issues. All of the race to the top money that was spent by the Department of Education during Obama's 4 years, the largest federal investment in K through 12 education in the history of our country. And for the schools that received those grants, it produced no demonstrable improvement in graduation rates, in test scores, in college acceptance. Well, what is it that is unclear about pouring more money into failing centrally planned systems with the hope that they're going to produce results? What is unclear about the results of that approach to Republicans and Democrats alike in this state?
There are decades of studies, hundreds of studies, showing no clear correlation between spending on education and educational result. One of the places I think I read that was in Al Gore's book back 15 years ago, Reinventing Government. Even he admitted it. Now, I don't think that's always true. I think that, class size, there might be particular areas of spending. Sure. And there may well be an appropriate adjustment in how state money is spread among school districts. This is a extremely complicated formula we have now.
Purposely so.
Yeah, no doubt. And certainly Chicago is crying wolf on this when they shouldn't be, because I have seen the numbers on that, and they get more. The total amount of money that flows to Chicago Public Schools is larger than 2/3 of the school districts in the state.
And it's larger than their percentage of K through 12 students in the state. So, for example, they have 19% of the student body K through 12 in the state. They get 25% of the poverty grants. So, Chicago's not being short funded.
Right.
It's a question of the outputs from the resources that you're given, and it's incredible to me that so few people want to make that argument about connecting inputs to outputs with respect to any of these systems where we spend the majority of our money and place the majority of emphasis in terms of the importance of the systems for the kind of citizens we're producing and the kind of opportunities they'll be able to avail themselves of when they grow up, or when they get up from off the floor if they have suffered a temporary setback and they need some state support.
Mike Royko had a wonderful article, this was probably 30 years ago, saying the real problem with Chicago public schools is that the parents are worthless bums, so something to that effect.
Well, yeah,
that's
Well, but I mean, I don't think that's limited to Chicago. I mean, this seems to be we're the only place in the Midwest, certainly, that clings to this notion that you continue to spend money at this trajectory on K-12, continue to see your property value go like this, and as I said before, the problem is it's not big
Well,
enough.
yeah, one of the projects that I wish I had time to take on, and somebody needs to, is really start digging into the operations of some of these school boards, because they are generally incompetent. And I've gotten tips sent to me. I just haven't had the time to follow up on them. But they're typically run by people in the community, and it's a popularity contest. That nobody's inclined to criticize their
Right.
neighbor. It really is like a high school election or
Student
something.
council election, yeah.
And they don't know what they're doing. I'll give you in New Trier,
Best public school in the state,
a
allegedly.
woman friend of mine, a liberal Democrat who's a very fine labor lawyer, pulled up the contract with the teachers union just out of curiosity, and she said it was just laughable. She said it looked like the initial first draft wish list that a union that it wasn't negotiated at all. And my guess is that's happening frequently in school districts around the state.
So people hate their money in Illinois. I mean, is that it? There's this kind of Stockholm syndrome, anti-money I make psychosis that I want to fritter it away.
Well, poll after poll shows, people, they want to spend more on education. Yeah, they want to. So, Republicans and Democrats are lighter for. I'm going to support education. I'm going to put more money in education, and that scores points with voters.
If you were the governor, if you were in Ronner's position, neither legislative leaders nor the governor have produced a document that truly balances the budget for even a single fiscal year.
That's right.
Much less deal with all the long-term infirmities that we've discussed. Would you produce that document knowing that the kind of restructuring and spending cuts that are required to balance the budget is going to be received very badly in the body politic because they're not used to that kind of shock to the system, and you just take it, or do you play the kind of binary blame game of I'm not the guy who's been here 40 years, that's Mike Madigan, and Mike Madigan says I'm not the rich billionaire who only cares about his rich friends, that's Ronner, and we just do this merry-go-round?
Yeah, what Ronner should do right now is tough. I mean, in a sense, he's done all he can. The legislature won't let him do anything dramatic. So, what has he done? He's kept the money in the pockets of taxpayers. Which is committed. That's all he has to show for it. But that's kind of all he could get probably. What he should do now, I'm thinking right now that the best approach would be to really level with the public, to go, get on TV and say, look, this is really bad, and use real numbers and not these phony budget numbers. The real budget is 3 times worse. Budget deficit is 3 times worse than the commonly used numbers that are out there. That's another piece of fiction. That's
so they say it's $5 billion. It's really $15 billion just for this fiscal year.
Probably 13 to 15. That's right, per year, and lay it all out and be totally honest that look, if we. And you need growth to restore the budget. That's one of the elements that everybody who's honest agrees has to be restored. But probably, tell people, look, you're going to have to give me a new legislature in 2 years, or this isn't going to work. I'll do the following for the next 2 years. It's not, I'm going to make it all temporary. But either you give me a legislature that allows me to do radical things in 2 years, or forget it. It's not going to work. And I'm kind of thinking that would be the best approach for him.
I just want to explore, since you're up in New Trier, kind of the leafy, Tony North Shore. These are the most educated, sophisticated people in the Western world, and I hear this all the time. I've been hearing this for 25 years, and yet they're the proponents of some of the most barbaric policies in the Western world. I just wonder if you could give our viewers some insight into what these conversations are like at cocktail parties, like you just mentioned with your liberal labor attorney friend who looks at the contract at New Trier and says, this is a joke. I mean, this is a joke, and so you're going to do something different, or you're just going to say, that's a joke, at least in my professional opinion. Now I'm going to ignore it and just play the same kind of sentimentality game that we've always played and hope, my kids can get out of here and I can get out of here before it all comes crashing down too. I mean, is that the posture? What's the posture? This is the Charles Murray question. Why don't the wealthy preach what they practice? They practice responsibility, work ethic, focus on making sure their children are being well educated, and they preach the precise opposite.
I'll give you hard data on that. I helped a little with a congressional candidate up there this past cycle. We polled that question, and one of them was we need to soak the rich to solve our problems. And I thought for sure that wouldn't resonate in the North Shore. This is the North Shore district. Overwhelming support for that. I mean, I was really stunned by that. I forget what the number, 80-some%, I think, for yes on that.
Soak the rich.
Soak the rich.
I'm the problem. Soak me.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And we're seeing it again we've got a big controversy at in New Trier School right now with they've got a day schedule, a mandatory attendance day on race relations,
Right.
where they've lined up this radically leftist agenda, and you'd be stunned by some of the comments that we're all racist. We just don't see it. So the kids need to go see this in order to understand how racist they are.
Well, maybe we could test the constitutionality of nationalizing at the state level all of the property and assets of North Shore residents. Everybody who said yes, soak the rich, that's fine. We're going to liquidate your home and all your assets, and we'll see what that number tallies up to. And maybe we won't have to do some of these other significant structural reforms because, we have solved the problem thanks to your munificence. What about that? Maybe that's something we should propose or poll test up there too to see to what extent they're willing to go. I mean, honestly, it's incredible to me. You have especially after November 8th, and it's not just about Trump, but it's about Trump is just a vessel for the revolt. But right. You have a revolt throughout the region, and I don't think people in the suburbs of Chicago are all that different than people in the suburbs of Milwaukee or St. Louis or Indianapolis or Philadelphia. And they're just making very, very different decisions than we're making here. And trying to penetrate the consciousness of your neighbors is really a mystery.
Well, it came through too in the Trump numbers too. And not that Trump doesn't have problems. I can list a long list that I agree with. But his performance, you saw how incredibly bad his performance was in Chicago suburbs and the North Shore. It was stunning. Really an outlier compared to the rest of the country with comparable demographics and everything. They don't feel that revolution. I am a big believer in that revolution as I charitably see it, sort of as I would hopefully define it. I think Trump may not be true to it and might screw it up by saying you're doing something stupid, but you're just a vessel of it. They don't see that revolution. They just haven't felt it, and it's palpable elsewhere, but it's not in the North Shore.
Well, it will be soon enough if everything you predict is comes to pass, sans these moves in the opposite direction. Right. So when does the revolt come to Illinois and to the North Shore in particular? That remains an open question, but Mark Glennon, founder of WirePoints, wirepoints.com, thanks so much for joining us on this edition of
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it.
Pleasure.